Okay, welcome everyone. Today is our 2023 last section of Asian philosophies. And we have a special speaker, CK, and going to talk about a forgotten scholar, Gu Hong Ming. Okay. So I believe most of people probably don't know who he is. And after today's 2 hours, you should know who he is. And then okay, so start from 2024. We will have our first section on January 13th. And then we have another special guest, Steve. He's going to introduce a new subject, history of ancient game of Go. Talking about Go game. Okay, so he probably have a 2 to 3 sections. 27 also talk about computer and ancient game of Go. And then, of course, Bhagavad Gita will continue to from chapter 11. SK Sashi is going to continue on chapter 11. For myself, start from January 20, we are going to read Feng Youlan's history of Chinese philosophy. And then this time I promise I'm not going to jump around. I'm going to do it from the first chapter to the probably 25 chapter. Okay, so that's for next year. And right now I'm going to turn to CK. I believe most of people know CK from my meetup and other meetup, and that's our pleasure to see his face first time. So let's welcome CK, and CK, please.
Thank you, Jason, for the kind introduction. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here today on a Saturday afternoon or evening, wherever you are in the world. Today, my presentation topic is Gu Hong Ming and the Spirit of the Chinese People, a case study. I think he's important and interesting and intriguing, because it is a story about a Sino-European Malay eccentric who straddles 3 worlds of his time. If anybody is wondering at this point, why I even bother presenting on him, please wait till the last, because the question on why will be answered in its totality, if I may. So if we can, please, the next slide. Oh, that's my biography. Firstly, I have many interests. I dabble in the subjects of history, philosophy, archaeology, and a few others. And during my younger days, I have grappled with some major philosophical issues, but as I know nothing, I didn't find any answers. So I continued with Confucius' attitude of storing this information but not discussing them, and got on with living my dear life with gratitude. I'm a student from the School of Hard Knocks, which means I can't graduate from it. I have varying degrees of ignorance, and I try not to be too clever. By half. I have other interests such as long-distance running, traveling, and watching movies. I think I have a good sense of humor, which some people may not agree, and I enjoy seeing the funny side of life. That's in a nutshell who I am. So the next slide, please. So the outline of my presentation goes as follows. I'll give a chronology of this man's life. Then I'll go and talk a bit about the international historical background during his time. Thirdly, I'll share a bit of his family background. And fourthly, a little about his education. And fifthly, which is quite important, the transformation that happened to him. And sixthly, a bit about his career. Then I'll talk a little about the spirit of the Chinese people, which is a very scary topic. And then number 8, I'll get some of the audience to read some of his quotes and famous sayings if we have time. And finally, I'll conclude by trying to answer the why question, why we even bother talking about it. So next slide, please. So first, the chronology of Gu Hong Ming's life. So on July 18, 1857, he was born as Gu Hong Ming in Penang, the Straits Settlements. And he was known initially at birth as Gu Hong Ming, which is the Hokkien or the Minnan pronunciation of his name. He was also known as Tang Sheng in Chinese, or Thompson in English, which is a very not a very Chinese name to give a person, Thompson, right? So he also used the pen name Amoy Ku. Well, that name Amoy is the pronunciation of the city of Xiamen that the Jesuits wrote down during the 16th century when they encountered Xiamen for the first time. So that is the pronunciation of the 16th century Jiangqiu or Zhangzhou Hokkien of the 16th century Ming Dynasty. So in 1867, he moved to Edinburgh, Scotland, with his godfather, Mr. Forbes Scott Brown. And then he was enrolled in a public school, and after that, an academy. So in 1873, he passed the entrance examinations for the University of Edinburgh for the Faculty of Arts. So in 1876, he obtained the Masters of Arts from the University of Edinburgh after studying under the famous Thomas Carlyle. He passed exams in Latin, ancient Greek, metaphysics, mathematics, moral philosophy, rhetoric, and social sciences with high scores, becoming the first person of Chinese ethnicity to complete the entire regimen of formal education in the United Kingdom, from grammar school to university, which was a big deal during the time because no one has ever done it before him. So in 1877 to 1880, he lived and studied on the European continent. He obtained a diploma in civil engineering from the University of Leipzig, and then afterwards a law degree from the University of Paris. From 1880 to 1882, he worked in the colonial administration of the Strait settlements in Singapore under British rule. Next page, please. In 1882, he met Ma Jianzhong, who was an advisor to the Qing dynasty official Li Hongzhang, where Gu Hong Ming conversed with Ma Jianzhong. Ma Jianzhong had a PhD from the École Libre des Sciences Politiques of 1879 for 3 days and 3 nights in French, which he spoke of it later in life as a life-transforming encounter. I don't think they spoke really for 3 days and nights. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but they did talk for a long time. From 1882 to 1885, Gu Hong Ming quit his post at the colonial administration of the Strait settlements and moved to Hong Kong, where he spent 3 years from 1882 to 1885 studying the Chinese classics using a Chinese-English dictionary. And afterwards, he started writing articles about Chinese culture in English in the North China Daily News. In 1885, Gu Hong Ming moved to Guangzhou, where he became a sort of foreign secretary to the then governor of Guangdong and Guangxi province, Mr. Zhang Zhidong, another famous personality. From 1885 to 1905, Gu Hong Ming served under Zhang Zhidong. Zhang Zhidong provided Gu Hong Ming with the means and resources to learn and improve his command of the Chinese language and classics, and gave him some of the best time of his life by having Gu Hong Ming involved in all kinds of foreign encounters and giving him time to study the Chinese classics in details. From 1905 to 1908, Zhang Zhidong felt that he had too much of a handful of Gu because Gu Hong Ming was becoming a little too provocative for Zhang Zhidong's liking. So Zhang Zhidong sent him to become the director of the Huangpu River Authority in Shanghai. From 1908 to 1910, Gu Hong Ming served in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Qing dynasty as vice director. So in 1911, he briefly served as the president of Nanyang Public School, a forerunner of the Shanghai Jiao Tong University. He resigned at the end of 1911 as a symbol of loyalty to the Qing dynasty empire, which was officially overthrown in 1912. In 1912, it was the era of the end of the Qing dynasty and the establishment of the Republic of China. Next page, please. In 1915, Gu Hong Ming published The Spirit of the Chinese People and became a lecturer at Peking University. He lectured on English literature and Latin. In 1917, Cai Yuanpei, famous Cai Yuanpei, became the president of Peking University. So Cai re-invited Gu Hong Ming to teach English literature at Peking University. In 1919, the May 4th movement broke out, and the new cultural movement came about as well, associated with the May 4th movement. Gu Hong Ming was very against the new cultural movement, as he was a staunch advocate of the traditional Chinese civilization. In 1924, and from 1924 to 1927, Gu Hong Ming lived in Japan and Japanese-occupied Taiwan for 3 years as a guest lecturer in Oriental Studies at some universities over there. On April 20th, 1928, Gu Hong Ming died in Peking, aged 70. He died in relative poverty. So next page, please. So as you can see, these are austere, august portraits of Mr. Gu Hong Ming. He's not somebody to mess around with, as you can see from his looks. So the next slide, please. So we can stop here for 2 questions or comments from the audience. Yes, James, please. You're muted.
Yeah, I'm awfully sorry. That was a beautiful introduction. A lot of it is confusing, right? Like, how did he got sent off to be an official on the river project in Shanghai, and then he was rescued back by the government a couple of years later. I mean, fantastic things happened to him. How did he run out of money? Did, you know, like, why was he poor at the end of his life after being after palling around with Tolstoy, and I read also Bertrand Russell. So it's just like, you know, and all these other people who are historically important. Definitely a qualified intellectual. How did he learn all those damn languages? Yeah, just incredible figure. So that's going to be a great session. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, James. Short answer is that he was very upright. He was incorruptible. He didn't take any bribes, so he had a nice stipend throughout his life while working. And but he was very flamboyant. He spent a lot of money. He had servants and hanger-ons, and he wasn't particularly good at investing his funds. So at the end of the day, you know, by the time he was 70, he discovered, whoa, well, you know, I spent all my money. Just like somebody who's never been really taught how to run their finances.
I'm thinking like a professional boxer or something like that.
Yeah. So if there's no more questions, let's carry on. The next slide.
I can have a comment on this.
Okay.
One thing interesting, if you look at the face, in Gu Hong Ming's face, he is a little bit like Western. So he has a European blood. Okay, if you look at his nose, right? It's like so actually I think his mother kind of half Portuguese, I think, you know. So he is a quarter European. That's my understanding.
Yes, indeed. That's very correct. On the next slide. So the international background during Gu Hong Ming's time. China experienced the Opium Wars from 1839 to 42, and then from 1856 to 60, which they lost tremendously. And then followed by that, or in between, there was the Taiping Rebellion from 1851 to 1864, resulting in over 60 million deaths and the sacking of 600 cities and towns in China. And after that, if they haven't had enough of it, there was the Sino-French War between August 1884 to April 1885, where the French attacked Taiwan. and also destroyed the Fuzhou dockyard in Fujian province. After that, before the Chinese could catch their breath, there was the Sino-Japanese War from 1894 to 1895, where they were roundly trounced in Korea and had to cede Taiwan to Japan. And following that, in 1900, there was the Boxer Uprising, resulting in the eight-nation intervention and the humiliating treaty in Beijing in 1900, whereby the Chinese were forced to pay 400 million taels of silver to the victorious powers, meaning each Chinese person has to pay 1 tael of silver. So China was very, very much humiliated. And by 1915, Japan had their notorious 21 demands imposed on the Chinese government. So China and its civilization were at rock bottom during Gu Hong Ming's era. The Chinese were actively searching for cures to save their country. So to give you an idea, China lost over 3.4 million square kilometers in area during this period. This is roughly the equivalent of the USA losing the states of Alaska, Washington State, Oregon, California, Nevada, Texas, and Florida. So if you want to compare it in the European context, these losses are approximately the same as all the territories of Portugal, Spain, France, Switzerland, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, Denmark, Austria, Hungary, Slovakia, Czech Republic, Poland, Belarus, Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Slovenia, Romania, Bulgaria, and Greece. The losses, are the equivalent of all these countries added together. Europe and the United States, on the other hand, were expansionists, supremely confident that they were on the right side of history, and that ideas such as positivism, social Darwinism, and capitalism were the right ways forward for all of humankind. So, in contrast, the Western world were very confident and victorious. However, confidence in the inevitability of Western triumph and the superiority of Western civilization took a severe battering during and after the First World War, when European states and empires turned on each other. Next slide, please. So if you look at this map, if you look at the ones in green, that was the territory of Manchu Qing China during the year 1760. If you look at the other map with in yellow, the ones in yellow are the boundaries of the Qing dynasty at its largest extent in 1760 and actually still in 1842. The ones with red lines are the current boundaries of the People's Republic of China. So you can see that the current boundaries of the People's Republic of China is much truncated. So they lost 3.4 million square kilometers. Well, it's a tremendous loss by any measure. So next slide. The Chinese Empire, the Qing dynasty, also suffered what is called the spheres of influence carve-out in 1900. You can see there, all the powers carved out spheres of influence in the Qing dynasty for themselves. The Japanese in light blue, having Korea and Formosa. The British had influence in Tibet and the Yangtze River Basin. The French in the south, in the Guangdong and Guangxi region, and the Russians in the far north, in the pink color area. So the areas where the Chinese Empire really had control were the ones in the middle. So it's really, really, truncated in that sense. So it was very humiliating for the Chinese. The next slide, please. Europe, on the other hand, had about 100 years of peace. In 1815, after the Napoleonic Wars, we have what is called the Congress of Vienna and the Concert of Europe, where there is this balance of power system where each state more or less were equivalent to one another in size, and they could counterbalance each other. So this system more or less preserved European peace for 100 years, from 1815 till 1914, with occasional hiccups. But these hiccups did not topple the apple cart. So next slide, please. The big change happened in 1871 when Prussia united Germany. So in the middle of Europe, there is this huge German empire that emerged in 1871 after the defeat of France in 1871. And then next slide. This is the map of Europe in 1914. As you can see, there are some empires over there: the Empire of Russia, the Empire of Austria-Hungary, the German Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. And next slide. After the First World War, this is the map of Europe in 1919. The First World War is used to be called the war that caused the downfall of 3 egos. I think it should be called the war that caused the downfall of 4 egos, because the German Empire was transformed into the Weimar Republic after the First World War. The Russian Empire ceased to be an empire; it became the USSR. The Austro-Hungarian Empire broke into many pieces, and the Ottoman Empire ceased to exist, also being broken up into many pieces. And in 1923, after the efforts of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, became the Republic of Turkey. So next slide, please. This is the map showing the territorial expansion of the United States. The West it's not only Europe, it also includes the United States and other Western powers. You can see that the United States started from the eastern seaboard and expanded all the way to the western seaboard by 1848. So not only did it gobble up lands belonging to the Native Americans, it also annexed territories belonging to Mexico and some to Spain. By 1898, it had taken over Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Hawaii. So Hawaii was the monarchy. The last queen of Hawaii was overthrown by an American-instigated coup d'etat in 1898. The last queen was deposed by force and placed under house arrest. And by 1898, the Philippines was also taken over by the United States. The Filipino War of Independence against Spain occurred in 1898, but the Americans intervened and took over the independence making for the Filipinos. It basically annexed the Philippines, resulting in about 200,000 deaths in the Philippines. So that is the territorial expansion of the United States. Next one. This is a photograph, also a map of the Japanese Empire in 1914. So Japan, as you can see, took over the southern end of Sakhalin Island, the whole of Korea, and Formosa, Taiwan, by 1914. Actually, by 1895, they already took over Taiwan. But during Gu Hong Ming's time, Japan was already an empire of quite considerable size. Next slide. Now I stop for some questions and comments, if any. If not, then we can carry on.
No comment, so let's move on.
Comment? No questions? Okay. So about his family background, his ancestor, Ko Lei Huan, Gu Li Huan in Chinese, was a wealthy and educated man who had earlier rebelled against the Manchu-led Chinese Qing dynasty and fled to Siam, which is Thailand, and the Malay states, to eventually settle in Penang as its first Capitan China. He was a merchant, planter, tax farmer, Chinese secret society headman, and one of a handful of pioneering leaders of Penang. So it's quite ironic because Gu Hong Ming is very loyal to the Manchu dynasty, to the Qing dynasty. His ancestor was a Qing dynasty rebel. So, you know, it's kind of a funny family background in this sense. There is a legend in Penang that Francis Light in 1786, when he landed in Penang, was kind of a little disappointed that there was no welcoming party to greet him. So he landed again. He had another ceremony. He got Go Lei Huan to bring together the Malays and the Chinese and other races, other ethnic groups to form a welcome party. So in 1786, Francis Light, who is now known as Sir Francis Light, re-landed in Penang, and there was a welcome party for him, organized by Mr. Go Lei Huan. So that's the funny side. Gu Hong Ming's father, Gu Ziyuan, was a rubber plantation superintendent whose ancestral hometown was in Tong'an, Fujian province, China. Tong'an is in, well, opposite the island of Xiamen today, I think. And his mother was reportedly a European of mixed parentage, either Portuguese or Portuguese Malay. Not much is known of his mother. Gu Hongming was a distant relative of Gu Xianrong of Taiwan, whose descendants included Gu Zhenfu. If anybody here is from Taiwan, they would know that the Gu family in Taiwan is a very renowned family. Gu Xianrong was the one who led the Japanese troops into Taipei, opened the gates of Taipei, and to the, depending on whom you ask, either sold out to the Japanese or restored order in Taipei during a time of chaos. So Gu Zhenfu was a Taiwanese businessman, a diplomat, and a film producer, and he was well known for his for being the counterpart in the 1992 consensus and the meeting with the mainland side called Wang Daohan in 1992, and in 1993 they met also in Singapore. So the next slide, please. So this is where Fujian province is located vis-a-vis the entire People's Republic of China. Is on the southeast coast. The next slide. This is a closer look at Fujian province. And this is the map on the right shows where Fujian province is in relation to its surrounding countries. Next slide. So the Strait Settlements is the settlement set up by the British. It started first in 1786 with the founding of Penang by Francis Light. And then in 1819, Sir Stamford Raffles founded Singapore. And finally, in 1824, the British took over the Dutch colony of Malacca from the Dutch in exchange for Bencoolen on the other side, which was a terrible deal for the Dutch. But the British managed to get these three entities together with the additions of some lesser important ones later on. And as you can see, by the addition of these three entities, the British controlled the Straits of Malacca, a very important waterway, even today. Next slide, please. Yes, that's where the Strait settlement sits today vis-a-vis the other countries in Southeast Asia. You can see that it is important. It controls the Straits of Malacca. So the next slide. Regarding his education, Gu Hongming was the first person of Chinese ethnicity to complete the entire regimen of formal education in the UK, from grammar school to university. He attended the University of Edinburgh, the University of Leipzig, and the University of Paris. He was fluent in English, French, German, and Russian, and was conversant in Latin, Greek, Malay, Japanese, Hokkien, and Italian. He knew Portuguese, Ancient Greek, and Ancient Hebrew. So he is a man of all nations and all seasons, I guess. The next slide, please. There's a picture of Old College in the University of Edinburgh, a very beautiful city. And if you could have a chance to go there, it could be a life transforming experience, because Edinburgh is beautiful. Next slide. This is the University of Leipzig, as taken in a photo of 1917. The main building was demolished by the East German government in, I think, after 1968, for reasons only known to them. Next slide. This is the University of Paris, the Sorbonne during the winter. I think the University of Paris is now composed of 13 universities. It's been reorganized after 1970 by President de Gaulle, I think. Yeah, next slide. Now we come to the transformation. So Gu Hong Ming met Ma Jianzhong in Singapore in 1882. Ma Jianzhong was an advisor to Li Hongzhang. Gu Hong Ming conversed with Ma Jianzhong for 3 days and nights in French, with their mutual language of conversation. And it was a life-transforming encounter for Gu Hong Ming. So Ma Jianzhong somehow managed to convince Gu Hong Ming to ditch the Strait settlements for China. Ma Jianzhong was very appreciative of Gu Hong Ming's many talents and felt that China would be the place where Gu Hong Ming could utilize his talents, as China needed people who understands the ways of the West and understands the civilization of the West. And Gu Hong Ming was convinced by Ma Jianzhong that he was not only European or Malay, he was also Chinese, and that he should go back to China to find out more about it and to return to his place of origin, or his so-called place of origin. So Gu Hong Ming never looked back and never returned to Penang or the Strait settlements for the rest of his life. That was how total his break was with that part of the world. He strove throughout his life to become fully Chinese. The next slide. So this is Monsieur Ma Jianzhong. As you can see, a very interesting looking chap who was trying to save his country. Next slide. Regarding his career, from 1880 to 1882, Gu Hong Ming, as I said before, worked in the colonial administration of the Strait settlements in Singapore. So in 1880, from 1885 to 1905, he served under Zhang Zhidong. From 1905 to 1908, he was the director of the Huangpu River Authority in Shanghai, probably because of his engineering degree obtained at the University of Leipzig. He knew how to sort out rivers, I guess. From 1908 to 1910, he served in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Qing dynasty as a vice director. And from 1911, he briefly served as a president of Nanyang Public School, who was a forerunner of the Shanghai Jiaotong University. He resigned at the end of 1911 out of loyalty to the Qing Empire. In 1915, Gu Hong Ming became a lecturer at Peking University. He lectured on English literature and Latin. In 1917, Tsai Ing-pei became the president of Peking University. He reinvited Gu Hong Ming to teach English literature there, after Gu Hong Ming was accused by university students at Peking University of not being serious about his lectures. Gu Hong Ming lectured very little. He spent most of his time, having fun. So he gave a lecture on the spirit of the Chinese people at Peking University auditorium to great applause, and then kept his job. From 1922, he was ousted from the Peking University for his regressive views. So from 1924 to 27, he lived in Japan and Japanese-occupied Taiwan for 3 years as a guest lecturer in Oriental Studies. The next slide, please. This is a picture, a photograph of Peking University's West Gate. lovely photo, which is why I included it. Next slide. So I pause here for some short questions or comments, if any. Okay, James.
Yeah, I guess I can see how he would. I guess what I'm reading in the Spirit of the Chinese People preface, I'm just beginning to look at it since I just saw this today, um, is like it's kind of like in that idea. It's in that why he was denounced in 1922 for being regressive. But on the other hand, it's a view of history that some conservative historians have to this day. The idea that nations have a character, and the character of the nations tends to lead them towards conflict, success, or failure. So I think that's a very nice insight that he has. It's consonant with George Hegel, the German philosopher, and I think he's possibly a very important Chinese thinker. I'm very impressed with his taking that position, even though it's a little bit clunky, sounds a little bit racialist sometimes, but regressive ideas that turn out to be very important. You talked about social determinism, like the what do you call it?
Social Darwinism.
Social Darwinism, social engineering, and it was very popular in Europe, and he picked it up. He picked up one of the major currents of his time, a kind of a racialist social tendency towards belief in the character of nations. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Madeline has the next question or comment.
Yes, thank you, CK. This is really great. I am stunned by the scope of everything you put together. It's incredibly helpful to see the other developments in world history and territories and conquests. My question is related to that, which is during this period when China was having to concede some of its territory, was that seen as a loss of the mandate of heaven of the ruler then? Or were they not really thinking in those terms at that point?
I think it is. It was seen as the gradual loss of the mandate of heaven to have lost territories on that scale. Yes, I would agree that that would be an indication that the mandate was being lost, if not lost. I think I'll take one last question from Guan.
Yeah, it's not really a question. It's more a short comment, because I think that it will come back later on the section on philosophy. But I think that, on the contrary, Gu Hong Ming was quite a person stressing on the universality of morality. And of course, what he said, that in different civilizations would have specific expression of that universal order, then he would call the appeal of the aesthetic of the gentleman. And that gentleman can be from an European background or from a Chinese background. But what is universal is the aesthetic appeal of the gentleman, meaning that civilization is not made of mechanical inventivity or of institutional structure, but rather in the making of the gentle person. But I stopped here because I'm sure that we'll have the occasion to come back to that big topic. Thanks.
Yeah, certainly. Okay, so next slide, please. So now we come to the scary part of it. It's called the spirit of the Chinese people. We're not talking about ghost here. We're talking about what in German is called the Geist, the manifestation of, or the spirit of a people. So in his book, in Chinese called 春秋大义. Gu Hong Ming had many eclectic ideas. I sort of distilled them and presented them here, perhaps not completely identical to what he said, but this is my synthesis of it. So Gu Hong Ming is anti-democratic. He presents a critique of Europe's descent into the First World War as due to the panic of the masses in the various European states, and not as a result of the leadership of diplomats, politicians, and generals. So he describes Anglo-Saxon democracy and European versions of democracy as democracy, right? The rule of the mob, and echoes Le Bon's, Gustave Le Bon's The Crowd, a study of the popular mind. He condemns Western imposition of democratic ideas on non-Western societies and civilizations as truly anti-democratic and hypocritical, as the West has imposed its values and ideas via the bullet and the machine gun, not by the force of evidence or persuasion. The next slide. He argues that Chinese civilization is superior to modern Western civilization and should serve as an example of how a society should function. He argues that Western civilization, especially in its modern, industrialized, and capitalistic forms, exists only for profit and is totally thus exploitative, leaving little room for humanity, as all humanity has become commodities to be traded, exchanged, and sold. Well, to quote a famous saying, the West knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. The central assumption of Western civilization to him, that man is evil by nature, implies that men in the West are only restrained by fear of the God, by the fear of God in the past, and then by the fear of the law courts and the fear of the police constable in the present. He contends that Western civilization is held together only by a negative force, by fear. Chinese civilization, on the other hand, assumes that man is good by nature, as taught by Confucius, as implied by Confucius and espoused by Mencius. As a result, men in China have little need for legal, religious, and martial restraints to condition their good behavior. The need and quest to be good is instilled in every Chinese child from young through the learning of the Confucian classics, with the belief in the perfectibility of man. Chinese civilization is held together by a positive force, in his view, by the belief in human goodness and the resulting order that belief creates. So the next slide, please. The law of the gentleman, as he calls it, and the religion of good citizenship in Chinese society guarantees order, respect, and the observance of rights and obligations without the need for overt laws. Moral codes, as learned from young in the Confucian schools, conditions society's behavior, resulting in good governance in the long run. So added to that, the Chinese want of exactness stands in stark contrast to the Western search for clarity and precision. The Chinese are able to absorb others into its civilization and enrich itself through the process, ensuring its enduring vitality and longevity. The Europeans and Americans, in contrast, is by constantly attempting to divide, delineate, define, classify, tabulate, and measure everything, has created divisions among its peoples, and these divisions are a constant cause of conflict. For example, well, just a very frivolous example, the Chinese way of cooking is very different from the way a European chef cooks. You know, the way the Chinese chef uses his ingredients shows the want of exactness that is so enduring of Chinese civilization. The Chinese, if you go to a Chinese kitchen and see a Chinese chef in action, you see that they don't measure things. Everything is done by feeling, by the sense of feel, you know, like how much sugar to use, how much salt to use, what to add to a concoction. You know, everything is artistry, is art. Whereas if we go to maybe a British kitchen. You have to be you have to have like how many grams of sugar, how many grams of salt measured accurately, right? So the next slide, please. He also argues that the Chinese have something that no other race in the world has, that of warmth and kindness, which in Chinese he calls wenliang. This quality ensures that the Chinese can survive centuries of humiliation and destitute and somehow still maintain their dignity and civilization, whereas Europe and the US have only blood, sweat, tears, or death to offer to the rest of the world. He argues that Europe and the West, after the devastation of the First World War, needs to turn to the superior civilization of China to save themselves from their own selfish destructiveness. He insists that the religion of good citizenship, that is Chinese civilization, will teach the West that the nature of man is good. Therefore, that you should love your own father and mother, and then you have to be loyal to your husband for a woman and to your king or sovereign for a man, so that there will be no need for priests or policemen to maintain law and order. When everybody knows their rightful place and rightful task, order and peace will be restored to society. The next slide. He argues that the Chinese do not need a religion of the European kind, as they already have a religion, and it is called the religion of good citizenship that Confucius bestowed upon his people. That is the secret sauce that keeps Chinese civilization alive and well through the travails of the 25th century since Confucius. The Chinese find solace and religiosity by honoring and praying to the ancestors, and by imagining that they will be with their ancestors and in turn be honored by their offsprings. Therefore, they are able to exist without the need for the religions of the European kind. Therefore, according to him, the West needs to pay Chinese civilization the respect it is long overdue and learn from its success for the sake of the West's own salvation. The West and the ignorant modern Chinese intellectuals and intelligentsia should stop corrupting Chinese youth with deplorable Western ideas that will not work in China. The next slide, please. So he has other English works and he has also German works. For example, his English works included Papers from a Viceroy's Yamen, a Chinese plea for the cause of good governance and true civilization, written in 1901. And then The Moral Causes of the Russo-Japanese War, The Universal Order for the Conduct of Life, The Story of a Chinese Oxford Movement, The Spirit of the Chinese People. He also translated some of the Confucian classics into English, such as The Discourses and Sayings of Confucius, which he did it in 1898, 论语, The Universal Order or Conduct of Life in 1912, which is 中庸, Higher Education in 1915, which is 大学, and he translated a rather obscure poem by William Cowper called he translated it as 痴汉骑马歌. So the diverting history of John Gilpin, which I have not read, but anyway, that's what he did. The next slide, please. So I need some volunteers. First, I prefer to have a lady volunteer to read the first few stanzas from the next slide. So any volunteers for his for this famous quotes and sayings on the Chinese spirit? Because I'm sick and tired of listening to my own voice. So hopefully somebody else could do the reading. No volunteers? Nobody wants to read? Oh, well.
Well, I can do it.
Okay, yeah, if you could, please.
Okay. Famous quotes and sayings on the Chinese spirit. The serene and blessed mood which enables us to see into the light of things, that is imaginative reason, that is the spirit of the Chinese people. I say that the total impression which the Chinese type of humanity makes upon you is that he's gentle, that he is inexpressibly gentle. When you analyze this quality of inexpressible gentleness in the real Chinese, you will find that it is the product of a combination of two things, namely sympathy and intelligence. There is in the true Chinese type of humanity an air of a quiet, sober, chastened mellowness, such as you will find in a piece of well-tempered metal. A gentleman, a product of a combination of two things, namely sympathy and intelligence.
Next slide, please.
Oh, I keep going?
Yeah, keep going, please.
The American people, I may be permitted to say here, find it difficult to understand the real Chinese and the Chinese civilization because the American people, as a rule, are broad, simple, but not deep. The English cannot understand the real Chinese and Chinese civilization because the English, as a rule, are deep, simple, but not broad. The German, again, cannot understand the real Chinese and the Chinese civilization because the Germans, especially the educated German, as a rule, are deep, broad, but not simple. The French, well, the French are the people, it seems to me, who can understand and has understood the real Chinese and the Chinese civilization best. The French, it is true, have not the depths of nature of the Germans, not the broadness of mind of the Americans, nor the simplicity of mind of the English. But the French people have to a preeminent degree a quality of mind, such as all the people I have mentioned above, all the people I have mentioned as a rule, have not a quality of mind which, above all things, is necessary in order to understand the real Chinese and the Chinese civilization. A quality of mind with delicacy. For in order to the three characteristics of the real Chinese and Chinese civilization, the picture, your picture's covering some of the words there. Which I mentioned, I guess. I must here add one more, and that the chief characteristic, namely delicacy, I cannot read those words because your pictures.
Yeah, it's called delicacy to a preeminent degree.
Such as you will find nowhere else except perhaps among the ancient
Greeks.
Greek civilization. I'm sorry, I wasn't able to.
That's fine. I mean, just carry on, please. You're almost there.
Oh, the Chinese are a polite people. What is the essence of politeness? Consideration for the feelings of others. La politesse du quoi, whatever. The politeness of the heart. The politeness of the Japanese, on the other hand, although elaborate, is not so pleasing. And I have heard some foreigners express their dislike of it because it is what may be called a rehearsed politeness, a politeness learned by heart as in a theatrical piece. It is not a spontaneous politeness which comes from the heart. In fact, the politeness of the Japanese is like a flower without fragrance, whereas the politeness of a really polite Chinese has a perfume like the aroma of a precious ointment, instar urgenty, fragranty, which comes from the heart. Wow.
Next slide, please.
Oh,
thank you. I think we're done. You're done. Jean, thanks. Can I have the next volunteer? So James, would like to?
Yeah, would like.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'll take a crack. The reason why the Chinese people do not feel the need of religion is because they have a Confucianism, a system of philosophy and ethics, a synthesis of human society and civilization, which can take the place of religion. The greatness of Confucianism lies in this, that it is not a religion. In fact, the greatness of Confucianism is that without being a religion, it can take the place of religion. It can make men do without religion. The belief in the absolute, supreme, transcendent, almighty power of the emperor also secures in the mind of the Chinese population the absolute stability and permanence of the state. This absolute stability and permanence of the state, again, secures the infinite continuance and lastingness of society. This infinite continuance and lastingness of society finally secures in the minds of the Chinese population the immortality of the race. The cult of ancestor worship taught in Confucianism secures the immortality of the race in the family. A Chinese, when he dies, is not consoled by the belief that he will live a life hereafter, but by the belief that his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, all those dearest to him, will remember him, think of him, love him to the end of time. And in that way, in his imagination, dying to a Chinese is like going on a long, long journey, if not with the hope, at least with a great perhaps of meeting again.
Next volunteer, please. Thanks, James. Any other volunteers?
I can
Okay,
volunteer.
Jason, please. Jason, please.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, I'll have a go. On why the West should learn from Chinese civilization and not the other way around. To the people of Europe and America, and in Japan and China too, today who speak of and want liberty, I will venture here to say that the only way it seems to me to get liberty, true liberty, is to behave themselves, to learn to behave themselves properly. Because the modern, cueless, up-to-date Chinese, the returned students, have learned from the people of Europe and America, learned from the European mob in Shanghai how to misbehave themselves, to behave themselves not as good citizens, but as a mob encouraged, coddled, and worshipped by the British diplomats and the British Inspector General of Customs in Peking. As Carlyle truly says, Europe is anarchy plus a constable. This religion of good citizenship in China is a religion which can keep the population of a country in order without priest and without policeman or soldier. In fact, with this religion of good citizenship, the population of China, a population as large, if not larger, than the whole population of the continent of Europe, are actually and practically kept in peace and order without priest and without policeman or soldier. So I go on.
No, yeah.
Here we go. The real Chinese, I say, is an invaluable asset of civilization because he is a person who costs the world little or nothing to keep him in order. Indeed, I would like here to warn the people of Europe and America not to destroy this invaluable asset of civilization, not to change and spoil the real Chinese, as they are now trying to do with their new learning. If the people of Europe and America succeed in destroying the real Chinese, the Chinese type of humanity, succeed in transforming the real Chinese into a European or American, i.e., to say a person who will require a priest or soldier to keep him in order, then surely they will increase the burden either of religion or of militarism of the world. This last item, at this moment, already becoming a danger and menace to civilization and humanity. But on the other hand, suppose one could, by some means or other, change the European or American type of humanity, transform the European or American into a real Chinese, who will then not require a priest or soldier to keep him in order. Just think what a burden will be taken off from the world. But then, it is important you should remember that this nation of children who live a life of the heart, who are so primitive in many of their ways, have yet a power of mind and rationality which you do not find in a primitive people. A power of mind and rationality which has enabled them to deal with the complex and difficult problems of social life, government, and civilization, with a success which, I will venture to say here, the ancient and modern nations of Europe have not been able to attain. A success so signal that they have been able practically and actually to keep in peace and order a greater portion of the population of the continent of Asia under a great empire.
So next slide. Yeah, thank you, Jason. One last volunteer, hopefully a lady, to read the last part. Any volunteers?
Let me do it again. Just
Okay.
there's no point in waiting. My cue can be seen, but yours are in your heart. In response to Peking University students who laughed at his hairstyle. Chinese is a language of the heart. It's difficult, not because it is complex, but because it is deep. Your English accent belongs with the lower classes. To Dr. Hu Shi, colleague of Peking University, who has a BA from Cornell University and a PhD from Columbia University. The spirit of commercialism is the real greatest enemy of the world today. Have you ever seen a cup with 4 teapots instead of a teapot with 4 cups? Saying attributed to Gu Hong Ming on why it is the natural state of affairs for Chinese men to have concubines.
Yep, next slide, please. So yeah, here we can have some questions or comments, if any. If not, then I can go on to the last section. Any questions, any comments? No? Okay, then we go to the next section.
I have some.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I just like to mention, what's this? Yeah, here he talk about Hu Shi, and he really has a problem with Hu Shi. Hu Shi is, if you're familiar with the Western, the European, the Russian, right? During that 19th century, they have the Westernizer and Slavophile, right? So kind of this kind of situation, and Hu Shi, and I can imagine totally he disrespect Hu Shi because first Hu Shi is too American, and the Gu Hong Ming is European educated. And to be honest, Hu Shi is good in philosophy thinking and political thinking, but probably not good in the literature. So Hu Shi's language skill is way, way below Gu Hong Ming's skill. So we can totally understand these 2 persons cannot get along. And then I don't know what's their real relationship, but I can see 2 persons are totally different.
Right. Any other comments or questions? No? Then we can proceed to the last section. Yeah, the why question, why Gu Hong Ming? Okay, I'll try to explain why he's interesting, at least to me. Well, Gu Hong Ming is was a staunch defender and advocate for Chinese civilization at its time of supreme crisis, which is a remarkable feat. Well, it is easy for us today, you know, if you're a Chinese person, today, to think that China is a great nation, is a rising or has risen, and that civilization in China has been or is great, because today China is the second largest economy in the world. So having that kind of confidence today is no big deal. But having that kind of confidence during the time of Gu Hong Ming, when China was down on its knees, was a big deal. So that is why he interests me, because his confidence in Chinese civilization defies the reality of his times, right? So he was also a proponent of Chinese civilization as a cure for the evils of Western civilization. And in this, was he ahead of his time? Well, if you take Western civilization to mean industrialization, capitalism, etc., then it does have many problems, many associated problems, as we are dealing with today. The ever ravagiousness of it, the ever acquisitiveness of that civilization, the destruction of the planet that comes along with it, you know, the fact that we are all spending ourselves into oblivion, that we treat each other generally as objects rather than subjects, that things like human beings could be traded and sold, not overtly, but you know, we consider one another as just our relationships are very transactional in this kind of civilization. So does he have a point? Maybe. So he's a romantic intellectual in the footsteps of Thomas Carlyle. He still is, I guess, if he's alive, anti-democratic. He's anti-industrialization. He's anti-modernity, and he's against the excesses of capitalism and its exploitative nature. So in the sense, Gu Hong Ming is coming from the European romantic tradition, whereby he believes that each nation has their merits, and that customs, traditions, and values that is inherent in each civilization or each nation should be respected and also observed. So it is, Gu Hong Ming is also an interesting study for me of a Sino-European person who became more Chinese than the Chinese. I think the Chinese were sort of blown away during his time by what he said, because he was more Chinese than any of them. You know, he tried to outfox them. He tried to outperform them. He defended the Qing dynasty at every turn. He defended the indefensible, and he made a mockery of himself sometimes in the process. But it is an interesting study of somebody who wants to become somebody else. Well, he was born of mixed parentage, but he wanted to become Chinese so much that he devoted himself completely to it. And in the process, became absorbed by it, became too much of an advocate for it, perhaps. But yeah, he's interesting in that sense. So it is a study also of a man from the periphery returning to the center, a kind of reinstatement of his identity. Gu Hong Ming was born at the periphery of, if we can take Southeast Asia or Penang in particular as the periphery of Chinese civilization. There are lots of Chinese people in Penang. That's the periphery. It is also the periphery of European civilization, because Penang was founded by Francis Light, and it has a significant British influence over there. So he was from the periphery, and he returned to the center twice. First, he returned to, well, he didn't return, but he went to Scotland, became British, studied got the full Monty of British education. So he was very well educated in the European sense. Then he went back to the periphery, tried to be a good British colonial official, but then rediscovered his Chinese-ness. And then he returned to China, the center or his center, and never looked back. So he was so total in his conversion that he went to Peking or Beijing in 1928 after 3 years in Japan and Japanese occupied Taiwan in order to make sure that he died in Peking or Beijing, the center of the center in his worldview. So the next slide, please. He is also a man of wit and humor who did not take himself all too seriously at times. So he's sort of an Englishman in Peking or a Scotsman in Peking. So if you are familiar with the song by Sting, Englishman in New York, like Gu Hong Ming is a little like that. You know, he's an eccentric in a very British sense. So his Chinese audience at times find him incomprehensible. But if you understand the way the British or the English behaves, that's totally understandable. You know, they're eccentrics. So the more educated one is, and the more gentlemanly one becomes, the more eccentric one could be. Gu Hong Ming is also a case for me of the crave for authenticity. He wanted to belong to an authentic and a great civilization he could call his own. He did not want to be a colonized person. So he wants to really break out of his colonized shelf to become truly authentic, to become a truly authentic Chinese person, in spite of him being of mixed European ancestry and Chinese ancestry. He straddled three worlds. In a way, he was also alienated 3 times in that sense. He straddled those of the British colonial world of the Strait settlements. He also belonged to the world of the industrializing West. And finally, he was also in the world of Chinese civilization. So a comparison, you can look at Karl Marx. So Karl Marx was born in Trier of Jewish parents who converted to Protestantism. So he was alienated there. He went to, he didn't like Germany, so he went and traveled around Europe. So, and then finally, he didn't even consider himself very much settled in England or France. So he was constantly on the move. So he was like very alienated in that sense. Marx was I think quite a good comparison to Gu Hong Ming. Gu Hong Ming is the first person of Chinese ethnicity to translate the Confucian classics into English. He improved on the translations of missionaries and sinologists such as Matteo Ricci and James Legge. So James Legge is the first professor of Chinese studies at the University of Oxford. James Legge was also a missionary. So many of these Chinese Confucian classics were translated by the missionaries and introduced into Europe. Many of these translations were not exactly good. So Gu Hong Ming improved on it and criticized many of these translations, and he came up with his own translations, which he thought were better ones. So, you know, it's a matter of opinion. He was forgotten by the Chinese, generally. Gu Hong Ming could be considered the lost Confucian scholar. His writings were ironically more influential among his Western audience during his time than among the Chinese. Literary figures as diverse as Ryunosuke Akutagawa, Somerset Maugham, and Rabindranath Tagore were all drawn to visit him when they were in China. Bertrand Russell echoed some of his sentiments, Gu Hong Ming's sentiments, when he lectured on philosophy in Peking in 1921. in the sense that Bertrand Russell considered Chinese civilization to be better than the Western civilization of the time as well. Bertrand Russell was trying to tell the Chinese, his Chinese audience, that their civilization were actually quite good, that there was not that much to learn from the West. But you know, of course, it was mostly met with some ridicule. Mohandas Gandhi called Gu Hong Ming the noblest Chinese. Leo Tolstoy respected and conversed with Gu Hong Ming over letters. Gu Hong Ming was at times an object of ridicule by his students and fellow colleagues at Peking University, and his ideas were seen as too backward by the Chinese intelligentsia of his period, while he did himself no favors, behaving in a provocative, eccentric, and at times incomprehensible manner during his tenure over there. Next slide, please. Okay, actually, I think there are some more. For example, Gu Hong Ming is like his ideas were echoed by later statesmen, such as you know, dare I say it, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, in terms of his advocate of Confucian values, or what it was later on misinterpreted as Asian values in the 1980s. So that, you know, Gu Hong Ming in that sense was a predictor of the rise of Asia in a sense. So we stop here for the finale, for comments and questions. It's a miracle that we could get through this whole presentation without getting into overtime. So we have some time for questions and comments. So I see Mark has a comment or question.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks a lot for the presentation. I thought that was pretty interesting, especially you explaining your interest in him, and you're explaining the context of the century of humiliation and how at the time that he was such a proponent of Chinese culture. I don't think he made this point, but you can correct me if you don't think this is accurate. A lot of Chinese at that point, I think, were looking to the outside world for ways to reinvigorate China, like looking to Christianity or Marxism or science or democracy, but things that came from foreign countries as a way of lifting China up and defeating foreign imperialism. Whereas Gu Hong was looking more inside, it seems like, to China, to Chinese traditions and to Chinese culture as a way of lifting China up. So that's an interesting contrast. And I agree with the point that you made that it seems a lot more viable. It seems more understandable now, seeing how much China has accomplished, than it would like in the middle of the century of humiliation. One more point, I'd like to hear what you think about that. But one other point, I'm a little bit of an expert on Marx, so I just want to make some comments on that. I think it's an interesting comparison in the sense that there's a similarity with Gu Hong Ming and Marx in the familiarity with a bunch of cultures and a broad cultural understanding. But the alienation thing, I think, is not quite right. Marx left Germany because he was arrested and tried, and then he was expelled from the country. And then he left France because he was thrown out of France by the French government. And then he left Belgium because he was thrown out of Belgium. And as far as I know, the only reason he died in England is because England was more tolerant and they would tolerate him and they didn't throw him out of the country. So I don't think he ever voluntarily moved from any country to another country. He was continually thrown out of one country after another because of his radical writings. Okay, that's all I have to say. Thank you.
I would agree with you. I think Marx was totally alienated, whereas Gu Hong Ming was only alienated 3 times over and tries to find comfort in the Chinese civilization, or solace, as he would put it. Next, I think is, I don't know who is next. I think James is next, if I'm not wrong.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I just love this. I think I was puzzling quite a bit over his accusation of the mob, the worship of the mob upon the English people. So why would he say in 1915 that the English people worshipped the mob, and I was having a little bit of trouble with it. But then I realized I'd read actually a book by an American historian, Buchanan, on the First World War. And he said that the British press and the British people, the British press basically advertised the war as the invasion of Belgium, the poor Belgians were being invaded by the Germans, and they didn't have a chance, and we needed to intervene to change them. And he said that intervention by the press was the reason for the mass war fever that developed in Great Britain. He thought that would not have happened if it hadn't been for the war tendencies of the press. In other words, you've got to go to war because there's a cause that you have to fulfill, and that is saving Belgians from Germans. So that was the first country to be invaded. So that's, I think, what he was referring to by this kind of simplicity. The British are simple, and the British believe in the authority of the mob. And the second thing I wanted to comment on was this idea from Chiquan, this idea of gentlemen, the authority of the gentleman, but I see it as authenticity. In other words, he has a philosophy of authenticity, and the authenticity of the Chinese that are free from religion, the Chinese that can actually, that have beliefs, but they're free from having a God, and he thought it had to do with the confidence in the emperor, and which is always a difficult thing because emperors come and go, we know, so it's not necessarily it's not always safe to trust the government. So that's another question. So this is a dialectic, right? This is something that's constantly in motion. Do we trust the government, or do we trust our beliefs, or do we trust all the individuals to do the right thing? That would be the worship, what he called the worship of the mob, which he was opposed to. And he said, by the way, correctly, that Americans are just like the British that way. So I think that's absolutely true. Whatever the government tells us, whatever war the government gets into or supports, we are kind of like energized to follow into. I hear comments from people all the time. Everybody supports this war. Everybody supports that. Why wouldn't you support the soldiers for doing this? So on and so forth. So so I think his characterization of the English-speaking world, I think, is a little bit correct there, and also his characterization of the Germans as being interested in order and power and so forth. Yeah, they are. Yeah, so it's they're the neatest people. Nobody can question that. So anyway, so thank you for presenting this, CK. This is a wonderful subject.
Thank you, James.
Very
Well,
interesting
he is obviously not the most politically correct person or the most politically correct intellectual. He aims, I think, in his mind to be correct, not to be politically correct. So what he said about these peoples or these races will not be what we dare to say today, or because of the march of political correctness. But because Gu Hong Ming lived in the 19th century and the early 20th century, he could say what he wanted. And as he's no longer with us, well, we can't sue him for that, right? So
well, we're not all cheering for political correctness, are we?
No, we're not. But to be able to say it the way he said it, he was also a product of his times. So I think the next person is Jason.
Yeah. Okay. So well, I read the not all, but part of the spirit of the Chinese people, and before this section, and Well, I mean, long time. I talk about 20, 30 years before I read part of that, and I ridicule it. Okay. And then because of this meetup, I give me a chance. I start to revisit and still ridicule people. And then I just have to say, if I read as a philosophical essay, it's totally ridiculous, and I can reject them all the way through from the very bottom. But today's section, CK, remind me, if I should read as a romantic writing, right? So Thomas Carlyle, his student of Thomas Carlyle, you should read as a romantic writer. So that's totally different flavor because you read it for fun, for the feeling. You should not read as a philosophical essay. If you read a philosophical essay, it's very wrong. And they also remind me one thing is how different in today. Today, we probably totally lost the romanticism, this kind of concept in our society. Okay, political correctness is more important. And I don't know, because my personal interest is in philosophy. So philosophical sound, okay, logical sound become more important to me. So I cannot say for the society. At least for me, I'm very far away from the romanticism. So you can see, I will totally agree with Hu Shi. I will totally against Gu Hong Ming's writing. But one thing I'm very interested in is Gu Hong Ming's translation of Confucius Analect. As a lot of people may know, I'm working very hard to translate Confucius Analect to English. And I try to buy from Amazon. They have the book. I cannot find the free PDF version. And take me a long time, haven't arrived yet. So next year, when I continue on the Confucius Analect, and I hope I can learn something from Gu Hong Ming's translation. I'm looking forward to reading his translation. Yeah, thank you.
Well, he wrote in excellent Victorian English, which is not the English that we are used to today. So you need to revisit the English language or the English writing style of that era. And for that, you can also make comparisons with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and the writing style then. It's quite indicative because every type of writing style they're all product of their era. And for Gu Hong Ming, it's very evident. If you read the English that people write today, it's not written in those ways. So yes, that in that sense, he did a service to transnational communication by transmuting the Confucian classics in better Victorian English to at least Britain. So Kwan, your question or comment?
Yes, first, CK, thanks for your excellent presentation on an outstanding character. Having lived during that infamous century of humiliation, but having kept his spine. And as you said very well, it's easy for us nowadays in 2023, but it was not obvious at all for him a century ago. So it was even more remarkable. That being said, I would like to say that what he has translated as the religion of good citizenship in Chinese is Chunzi Chutao. Okay, so Chunzi Chutao means the way of the gentleman. So Junzi, for those who have attended the sessions on the Analects, you all recognize that Chunzi is the Chinese word for gentleman. So I want to say that Gu Hong Ming is absolutely, fundamentally, organically, and completely rooted in classical Confucianism. Because what he has translated as the religion of good Confucianism is precisely that invitation to be a gentleman. And when he was against the mob rule, it was precisely the same old Platonic appeal to evolve epistemologically, and that is the only way to be a good person, meaning cultivating your capacity for goodness, beauty, and truth. rather than precisely, as you said, and as Gu Hong Ming said, in need of a policeman and of an army to maintain order. That I want to read maybe 10 lines from a short paragraph from Professor Wang Huaiyu, who is teaching in the United States on Gu Hong Ming. And I think that it synthesized marvelously his idea, with your permission, of course.
Of course, yeah. Carry
okay,
on.
so the aesthetic appeal of the gentleman and the universal order of civilization. Gu's vision to bridge the divide between East and West by joining the best with best stems from his deep familiarity with both classical Confucian teaching and modern romantic ideas. As Gu sees it, there's very little difference between the East of Confucius and the West of Shakespeare and Goethe. Accordingly, those who well know both know that the best in China and in the West are in perfect harmony. Let the best of the two civilizations unite, and nothing but good will follow. And I stop here because what he was advocating was precisely not to use a fake front of liberalism or so-called liberalism for what is, after all, an plutocratic attitude. Okay, as you read the Gu Hong Ming's words, you know that he wrote that most of the so-called civilized people are imposing their order because they have a greater number of machine guns. Maybe nowadays he would not have written machine guns, but missiles, for example. But that is a technical detail. So what he said that after all, the true civilization, of course, I am not rejecting material comfort, political advancement, and technological development, but those being needed. But what is true civilization, as he said and wrote, is precisely the making of the civil person, of the person capable of having a true heart and a gentle mind, and having a true heart and a gentle mind being precisely a Junzi, a gentleman. So once again, the religion of good citizenship, Junzi, Chutao, is the way of the gentleman. And it's absolutely normal that he has translated the 4 books, the Analects, the Ta Sui, the Great Learning, the Chong Yong, the Doctrine of the Mean. I don't know if he translated the Mencius too. Anyway, he did not translate the last one. Okay, so he at least he translated 3 of the 4 books, meaning the core of the epistemological manual of the Confucian school, which is perfectly normal since he was advocating that religion of good citizenship, or the Junzi Chutao. And a last comment on the fact that he promoted that the best from the West and the best from the East would join, because as he wrote, there is no difference in the true values coming from Confucius in the East and the true human values coming from Shakespeare or Goethe from the West. And and it goes with the fact that he was against the mob rule, okay? Because to go back to Plato's ideas, the mob, or even the democratic man, okay, the democratic man, according to Plato, is the man motivated by lex talionis, meaning the motivation for revenge, for tribal affinities, and for hedonism. So if you put the democratic man from the East and the democratic man from the West together, or the plutocratic man from the West and the plutocratic man from the East together, meaning man's motivated by profits, powers, and wealth for themselves and not as tools of power for higher purposes, you will only have problems and war. But if you put together aristocratic man from the West and aristocratic man from the East, what Confucius called Junzi, the gentleman, and that Plato called the aristocratic man. Only the best can be the consequences of such meeting. And I stop here.
Yeah, I think Jean has a question or comment.
Just a quick comment, not about his philosophy. I have yet to read more. It's earlier you mentioned that Gu Hong Ming was forgotten in China. I think people are picking him up right now in China. He's back to the market. I happen to just see a clip of maybe a TV show. Yes, like Gu Hong Ming in Beijing University, all that thing. What I'm thinking is, in China, nationalism is running very high right now, and I think Chinese people, whatever generation that is finding it surprising, and then also encouraging that somebody 100 years ago was talking about China like that. That kind of, I would say, it was a kind of arrogance that he showed. But you need to be confident to have that kind of arrogance. That's what I want to say.
Yeah, I would like to add a little to that. I mean, Gu Hong Ming's so-called arrogance didn't exist out of thin air. He was thoroughly educated in the classics, in Latin, and in rhetoric and all the ancient subjects at the University of Edinburgh. So he was well tutored by Thomas Carlyle, who was himself a romantic and a critique of capitalism and modernity during his time. So Gu Hong Ming had the full dose of criticisms of Western civilization, and he was not he didn't feel inferior in front of the West because he was also from the West. So he felt totally at home criticizing it, unlike the other Chinese intellectuals of his time who were only scrambling to try to understand what hit them. Gu Hong Ming completely understood from his point of view what Western civilization was. And if you can bear with me, when Gandhi, when asked about his idea of Western civilization, replied, a good idea. So, Gu Hong Ming didn't exist. His arrogance didn't exist in a vacuum. He had good reasons to be arrogant from his point of view. So Clem, you're next.
All right. Well, thank you so much for this wonderful introduction. Yeah, it's he does strike me as one figure of probably of many of the similar functionality, should I say, or capacity. And by that I mean that it's one of those figures that tries to maybe potentially synthesize the Western knowledge tradition and the tradition of their origin, and I think it's roughly the same time frame that I'm talking about. Like one other figure from India that comes to mind that almost did the similar type of feat, trying to synthesize, combine getting education in the West and then digesting all that cultural heritage and then coming back to the source of origin. So the other name that comes to mind is Ananda Coomaraswamy from the Indian tradition, who was a brilliant scholar and who surprisingly had a similar origin. I think he was the son maybe of a Tamil father and a British mother, and he then he got his education in the West and became a scholar. Actually, he served as a curator of British Museum, I believe, and then he wrote extensively on the Indian tradition and the Indian culture. So there's some kind of I should say maybe like national or ethnic revival that goes on around those times, which I do think it's a very positive thing, and it should it should happen when you go back to your source, to your roots, and you try to understand not just from your own perspective, but having kind of being able to compare it to other civilizations. So my questions, and I thank Quan Li also, because I think he might already answered my two other connected questions to that. So my questions were, did Gu Hong, did he completely reject what he learned in the West? And it appears that no, that he was able actually to kind of, because he was a sound proponent of the Chinese way, right? He almost used that as a model to say, hey, get rid of all this war attitude, all this strife that goes in the West at that time, and use Confucius or use the Chinese tradition as something you can learn. But was he proposing that as a model to other traditions, other nations, other civilizations, or was he saying, no, learn from us and kind of maybe adjust your ways, right? Don't get rid of your cultural heritage, but maybe rethink, do what I did. Like I kind of went, I learned from you guys. Now it's your turn, to learn from us, and maybe we'll have a dialogue, right? Rather than imposing a Chinese model. Maybe that's what he was trying to say, but it's an open question. And it does look, to me, it does look like he was able to synthesize and learn. At least that's the I guess the hope that I would have. But I think Quan Li kind of talked to that, so maybe it's still an open question.
Yeah, I think if I may try to answer that, Gu Hong Ming was provocative. He arrogantly stated that the West should learn from China. But I think in his more reasonable moments, he would come to the conclusion that there is a lot to learn by China from the West and vice versa, so that a synthesis, a better civilization might emerge from the process. I think when he is less provocative and less antagonistic, that would be his logical conclusion. But as he is not amongst us now, I can't go and ask him the question.
Yeah.
So I don't know who is next, whether it's Quan or Jason.
Quan, go first.
Okay, thank you, Jason. Well, I think that it's a good moment for me to say that Gu Hong Ming is no longer among us, but he answered to us by writing something to that effect. Because when he wrote that the best in the West and the best in the East should be together, he acknowledged the high civilization of the West when he wrote that what the essence from Confucianism is the same, that the essence from Shakespeare and from Goethe. Well, I think that he answered quite crystal clear, that he acknowledged the high moral civilization of the West that was not maybe expressed in a high manner in the 19th century. That was, he was speaking of the number of machine guns, but in potentiality, it was there. And he acknowledged that potentiality. The other thing that I wanted to say is that from 1885, he was 28 years old at the time. He started to work for Chiang Chu-tong, the viceroy of Guangdong with Guangxi. And let's say that he remained in the orbit of Chiang Chu-tong and of his a group of scholar officials for more or less the next 20 years. Okay, so from 28 to 45, 48. And you know perfectly that Chiang Chu-tong is famous for his expression, Ti Yong. Okay, so Ti is the essence of Chinese civilization in terms of morality, of ethics, of epistemology, and Yong, which is the technological development. And as you said, most Chinese intellectuals at the time were scrambling for the Yong, for the technological dimension. And paradoxically, political people that Gu Hong Ming would not approve at all nowadays, which is the Communist Party of China, more or less achieve that Yong part, okay, the technological advancement that was needed. so it took about a century. And paradoxically, or maybe not so paradoxically, the thinkers within the Communist Party of China are also beginning to promote a return to Confucianism, meaning the essence, the roots of Chinese civilization, 君子之道, the way of the gentleman. I stop here.
Yeah, I actually would like to say something maybe related, maybe not related at all to what you just said, Guan. I think the central question that Gu Hong Ming, maybe without realizing, was trying to answer is this: how should non-Western civilizations rise to the challenge of the West without becoming like the West? How do they escape the clutches of the West without becoming like the West? Because if you look at the case of Japan, Japan learned from the West and became very much like the West in terms of acquiring empires. So in a sense, it became like the West, although the Japanese would object that they are the West, or maybe they don't, depending on whom you ask. So that is the question. I think it's still being answered today. Is there an alternative to Western civilization in our world that will work? Yeah. So Jason, I think you are next.
Yeah, I'm going to take a totally different position on this one. I expect a lot of disagree with people. People disagree with me, but I that's the way I look at. I not all. I read a few, probably 10, 20 pages on his spirit of the Chinese people. I don't feel he is a Chinese. Okay, I feel, okay, by reading that, it's a Westerner or Englishman criticize their own culture. That's my reading. And then when I think back his education, he doesn't, unlike Hu Si or Feng Youlan, they have a solid traditional Chinese education. They went to America, okay, to learn Western culture. He's different. He is, I don't know what kind of education he received, but I believe probably not very solid. So his foundation is European or Englishman. So he went back to China to learn Chinese in more depth, and no doubt that he's genius in language. Okay, so he can quickly learn Chinese language on the language level. Okay. So in this way, that's my feeling. His writing is, give me the feeling. If you have time, you probably try to read it. My feeling is not Chinese talking about English. It's like Englishmen criticize his own culture, just like today you have other American. You know, you read the editorial page in the newspaper that will criticize, oh, our system is broken. That's wrong in our society. Kind of like this kind of tone. That's what I read, you know. But anyway, okay, that's just my opinion. And then I really appreciate, you know, we have this opportunity. Like I said, this one is an open forum, and any kind of opinion, as long as we keep our gentleman style, and they'll be all welcome. And that's my opinion. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jason, for your comments. Mark's next.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. I found that very interesting. And it makes a lot of sense to me, your comments. One of the things that I noted was, so I'm not very familiar with him. I just know what was in this introduction. I didn't even read the Wikipedia article. So there's a lot of ignorance speaking here. But just based on this presentation and discussion, there's a ethnocentric trend in every culture, as far as I can find. I've even met a Lebanese guy talking about how Lebanon is God's country and it's the best country in the world, and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. You can find somebody that exalts their own culture above others, as far as I can tell, pretty much everywhere. So that, I mean, China is a bigger and an older civilization than most. So there's more ammunition to work with there as far as having kind of an ethnocentric viewpoint. But I think part of the criticism of foreign imperialism is really lacking a view of history. One of the things about China that's particularly unique is that it had been relatively politically stable for, I don't know, like 600 years or something. The Qing, the Ming, and the Yuan dynasties followed each other in fairly rapid succession. And China has very definite and strategically defendable borders. It's got oceans on one side, it's got desert on the north, it's got mountains on the southeast. So the potential for conflict with other powers is limited until the rise of European colonialism, where the European powers were not the traditional land empires of the past, like the Persian empires or the Ottoman Empire or the Mongols, etc. They were oceanic empires. And so that imperialism was able to transcend those borders, which China had been able to maintain for a long time with their navies. And then similarly, Japan picked up that same pattern of being a naval empire, which was something that China never was. But China has plenty of history of bloodshed. If you go back far enough, if you go back to the Warring States periods or other periods between great empires, there's plenty of bloodshed in Chinese history before the consolidation within those natural borders, which was what China had been experiencing for basically three dynasties prior to the arrival of the European colonialists. So I think this assertion that this warlike imperial aspect is a nature of European culture is wrong. I think it's China's relative period of peace for half a millennia prior to its encounter with European colonialism was mostly a fact of its borders. Yeah, that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mark. I think Kwan's next.
Yeah, I would like to give a very modest and very laughable answer to your question, CK. What would guarantee the other civilization to have their own path? Well, my laughable answer for now, but which would need more further development, of course, is to have enough missiles and machine guns for now.
Well, I think that's a very good start.
It's a start, of course. I'm grateful to you for having said that. It's a start, but it's a absolutely needed start.
Yeah, once you have stable borders, you have security, then you can talk about civilization, which is very Confucian.
It's also a kind of a pyramid of Maslow too, CK.
Yes. Yeah. Well, what Mark just mentioned before you, Guan, is quite interesting. I think if I may try to reply, I think China's borders, yes, they are stuck in a sort of trap in a big box, if we can put it that way, with naturally defensible borders, north, south, east, and west. And to that extent, once the Chinese have reached these natural borders, they somehow decided that they had enough, they are content, they're no longer interested in colonizing the rest of the world. And to that extent, they are different from the West, because the West went out and explored the world and the seven seas and colonized them all. Whereas under Admiral Zheng He, China went out and explored the seven seas and thereby called Sinbad the Sailor, who traveled the seven seas, but didn't occupy these lands. They just brought back tribute and a lot of exotic animals like the giraffe and the zebras. And after that, literally forgot about these lands. So the motivations were very different. I think capitalism, by the search for spices and profit, brought a dynamic that is not present in other civilizations. Like industrialization and capitalism brought forth this profit-making incentive that is absent in Chinese civilization prior to China adopting similar measures later on. So, yeah.
May I interrupt?
Sure.
Okay, I would say that the profit-making mentality exists also in the Chinese civilization, but the Chinese upper class always crushed the merchant class, so it never had the chance to become a cancer like in the West.
Yes, I think you're right, because the merchants were placed at the only a class above the soldiers. So they're thought of very lowly in traditional Chinese society.
Absolutely, and that is perfectly the Platonic hierarchy too, okay? The plutocratic man, the man motivated by profits, is a lowly man and cannot be a ruler. And I would say that that is the essential difference in Chinese civilization. But I would say that what happened in the 19th century is that we learned that we needed to get the tools of power, not to be invaded. That is the difference.
Okay, so I think time is up. We have spent 4 hours, about 2 hours, I'm sorry. So thank you, CK, very much. And then we all have a different opinion, and then that's the purpose of our meetup. So have a nice holiday, and then at least we may disagree on many things. At least I disagree on many things, but you know that's the way of learning, and I really appreciate CK. And then I think the great lesson we learned is we need to upgrade our meetup standard, at least our dress code. So thank you, CK, for dress up for us, and then we have to think about enforce dress code next time. Thank you.
Well, you know, my answer is that once I dress up, then I can cover up my ignorance, right?
Well, CK, you should have dressed up like a Chinese gentleman of the 19th century, like Gu Hong Ming.
Yeah, unfortunately, those clothes are very expensive.
Oh, come on, come on, come on. They are available.
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you everyone, and happy holiday, and hope to see you guys on the January 13th. We will change a totally different subject, and let's try to understand the Go game and about our another guest speaker, Steve. Okay, thank you. And
well, thank you, and
bye-bye.
Okay,
Merry Christmas to all.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Happy holidays.